Welcome to Nocturnal Tales. Tonight, we journey to the snow-draped hills of 1925 Dordogne, where Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings seek respite in a quaint French village, only to be drawn into the shadowed halls of Château Vernet. Join us for Murder in the Château, a tale of family secrets and deadly deception, crafted in homage to the masterful Agatha Christie, whose genius we honor, though this enigma unfolds on our own terms. Before we begin, share in the comments. Where are you joining us from tonight? Your presence illuminates our journey through these shadowed mysteries. If this tale captivates your imagination, consider supporting us through our membership program, which includes access to ad-free versions of all our stories and exclusive content, or leave us a tip. Every contribution helps keep these mysteries alive in the darkness. Now, let the story unfold. Chapter 1. A Death in the Snow. It is one of the peculiarities of my friendship with Hercule Poirot that peace and quiet rarely last long. The man has a genius, to be sure, of that no one doubts. But with genius, as I've often found, comes a certain magnetic attraction for trouble. Even when we intend nothing more than a quiet holiday, fate has a way of intervening. In December of 1925, Poirot declared that he had been overexerting the little grey cells, and must absolutely take a rest. "A man must not be a slave to brilliance, Hastings," he said solemnly, folding his napkin after breakfast one cold London morning. Even I, must retreat sometimes into comfort and calm." As luck would have it, a letter arrived that very afternoon from Monsieur Giraud, a retired magistrate and an old acquaintance of Poirot's from his early days in France. Giraud had recently taken up residence in the village of Saint-Forgeux, a sleepy corner of Dordogne, and suggested that Poirot join him for Christmas and New Year's. The air was bracing, he said, the food excellent, the wine even better, and the pace of life slow. Perhaps at last, slow enough to soothe even the great detective's nerves. "Charming," I said when Poirot handed me the letter. "You could do with a bit of quiet." "Exactement." And so we departed England a few days before Christmas, taking the boat train to Paris, and from there journeying south by railway through the Loire Valley and into the gentle hills of the Périgord. As we travelled, the scenery changed from grey to white. Frost-tipped trees, snow-covered fields, and slate roofs dusted with powder. I had never been to Dordogne in winter, and found the stillness of it curiously beautiful. Upon arriving in Saint-Forgeux, little more than a huddle of stone houses, really, we were met by Giraud himself, bundled in a scarf and greatcoat. He welcomed us warmly and drove us in his motor car to the inn, where rooms had been prepared for us. The village, he explained, lay in the shadow of the Château Vernet, a grand estate just beyond the woods, owned by Monsieur Etienne Vernet, a local landowner and minor nobleman. "I know the family well," Giraud said. "They're old stock, though their fortune has dwindled. Etienne is a proud man, and stubborn like his late father. But his wife, Elodie, she's something else. Cool as glass, that one." His tone was neutral, but not without edge. I noted it and filed it away. We spent the first 2 days strolling the countryside, playing cards by the fire and sampling the local delicacies, of which there were many. Poirot, to my surprise, seemed almost content. "There is balance here, Hastings," he said, as we sipped vin chaud in the tavern. "The symmetry of the vineyards, the stillness of the snow. Even the cows, they are orderly. C'est parfait." Naturally, that was the precise moment when everything changed. On the morning of the third day, as the snow outside lay undisturbed and crystalline upon the village rooftops, a sharp knock came at our door, urgent, insistent, and entirely out of harmony with the calm that had reigned thus far. Poirot and I exchanged a glance. He was just smoothing the cuffs of his dressing gown, while I had been contentedly reading the local paper by the fire. It was early still, and we had not expected company. I rose to answer it, and there stood Monsieur Giraud, hat in hand, his overcoat dusted with frost, and his complexion several shades paler than it had been the evening before. Though he was a man generally possessed of calm judicial reserve, this morning he wore the unmistakable mask of agitation. "I beg your pardon for the intrusion," he said in a low voice, stepping inside as I ushered him from the cold. "But there has been a development of some gravity." Poirot, who had already risen to his feet, narrowed his eyes with sudden intensity. "A development, you say? Do not keep us in suspense, mon vieux. Has there been a crime?" Giraud hesitated, pressing his lips into a thin line. "Worse, I fear. A death." The air in the room seemed to constrict at once. Poirot's expression shifted subtly, from interest to concern, and then to that unmistakable sharpness which always marked the beginning of a case. With no further prompting, I rang for coffee, and we bade Giraud sit. He remained standing. "It is Etienne Vernet," he said finally, "the master of the Château. He died in the early hours of the morning, quite suddenly, quite violently." Poirot tilted his head. "Mon Dieu, an accident?" "The attending physician does not believe so. The symptoms, he says, suggest something far more sinister. Vomiting, seizures, laboured breathing. He suspects poisoning." Poirot's brow furrowed. "And the local authorities?" "I called the inspector myself," Giraud replied grimly. "But as I feared, his attentions have already fixed themselves upon Madame Élodie Vernet. I must confess I started at that." "His own wife? That's rather a bold conclusion." "It is," Giraud admitted, "and perhaps premature. But you know as well as I do how easily the spectre of inheritance clouds judgment, particularly in provincial minds already prone to suspicion. I have known the Vernet family for many years, and though I cannot say with certainty what lies beneath the surface, I do know this. When money, property, and blood are entwined, the truth is rarely simple." Poirot's eyes glittered with interest now, and he motioned for Giraud to continue. "Etienne inherited the Château in full after the death of his father," Giraud went on. "The land, the vineyards, the title, all passed directly to him. His sister, Mademoiselle Marie Vernet, was left with a modest stipend and little else. The widow, Élodie, of course, stood to gain everything upon his death. The estate, under local law, will now pass into her hands, unless, of course, a criminal charge intervenes." There was a long silence. "And what of the circumstances of this alleged poisoning?" Poirot asked finally. "An almond cake, apparently. Prepared by Élodie herself the previous evening. A family recipe. Only Etienne ate of it. The others declined. He was taken ill not long after supper and never recovered. The staff are already whispering, and the inspector is only too eager to believe them." I gave a low whistle. "That's rather damning." Poirot raised a finger. "No, Hastings, it is not damning. It is convenient. Too convenient, perhaps. Almonds, after all, are the scent most notoriously associated with cyanide. It is the first thing even the most unimaginative constable would notice." He turned to Giraud. "My friend, you have done well to come to me. I do not like coincidences. They are the laziest of lies." He stood, brushing an invisible fleck from his sleeve. "It seems, Hastings, that our restful holiday has taken on a rather different character. The Château awaits, and I believe Madame Élodie Vernet will soon require the services of Hercule Poirot." Chapter 2. The Widow Élodie. The Château Vernet emerged through the mist, like something torn from the pages of a Gothic romance. Its towers stooped with age, its ivy-clad walls black against the blanket of snow. As our motor car crunched up the long gravel drive, The house loomed ahead of us, silent and statuesque, the great fir trees lining the path casting long funereal shadows across the grounds. We were met at the entrance not by a servant, but by Mademoiselle Marie Vernet, the late Monsieur's sister, a tall, sallow-faced woman with sharp cheekbones and the air of one who had been perpetually disappointed by life. Her mourning attire, though not yet fully in place, was already present in the severity of her black gloves and the funereal pin at her collar. "You are the detective?" she asked, her eyes darting with suspicion toward Poirot. Poirot inclined his head with courteous precision. "Hercule Poirot, at your service, and this is my friend and associate, Captain Hastings." She offered no hand, only a slight nod, and stepped back to allow us entry. The entrance hall was large, stone-flagged, and faintly echoing. A fireplace gaped cold and empty on the far wall, above which hung a portrait of an austere gentleman with the unmistakable eyes of Etienne Vernet. Everything bore the smell of old wax and old secrets. "I assume you're here at the request of Monsieur Giraud," Marie said as she led us through the gallery, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before outside interference was brought in." "Madame," Poirot said gently, "I am not here to interfere, only to observe, and perhaps to see what others have missed." We were shown to the small salon, a handsome room of brocade and dark wood, where the widow awaited us. Madame Élodie Vernet rose from a settee as we entered, composed but pale. She was striking. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but elegant in that effortless way French women seem to possess as a birthright. Her hair was dark and coiled at the nape of her neck. Her eyes, a stormy grey, held a quiet intelligence behind their veil of grief. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, "they tell me you have come to ask questions." "If you are willing, madam." She gestured for us to sit. I watched her closely, expecting some hint of agitation, a tremor of the hand, a defiance in the eyes. But she bore our scrutiny with calm resolve. She poured tea as if entertaining guests, not under suspicion for murder. Just then, the heavy wooden door creaked open once more, and a stout man in a threadbare uniform entered briskly, his face flushed with the chill and excitement of his task. Inspector Duval, the local magistrate, had arrived with a mixture of official pomp and palpable impatience. He greeted Poirot with a curt nod and immediately launched into a report, his voice brisk and eager. "Monsieur Poirot, the evidence is clear. Poisoning without question. Madame Élodie is the prime suspect. The family is restless, and justice must be swift." Poirot, however, met his zeal with calm poise, replying quietly, "Inspector, justice requires patience, and truth requires proof." Duval's glare flickered briefly, but he said no more, standing stiffly by the window as the tension in the room deepened. "My husband," she began, "retired to bed at 9 o'clock. He had complained of a headache and some discomfort after supper. At midnight I was awakened by his cries. He was in agony. I summoned the doctor at once, but by the time he arrived—" She drew in a shallow breath. It was too late. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And the supper?" "It was said to have included a cake, no?" "Yes. I made it myself. A gâteau d'amande, almond cake. Etienne was fond of it." Her gaze did not waver. "But it is absurd to think I would poison my own husband with a cake I served him in full view of the household. There were 4 people in that room. Yet only one partook. He insisted. The rest of us had eaten earlier. He was late returning from town." "May I ask who else was present?" "My sister-in-law, Marie, our housekeeper, Claudine, and the cook, Madame Javet, who brought the dish in. All will confirm what I have said." Poirot gave a faint nod, Forgive the question, madam, but had your husband enemies? Any recent quarrels? Financial distress, perhaps? A flash of something crossed her face. Distaste, perhaps, or hesitation. He was not a man given to peace, Monsieur Poirot. My husband was proud, arrogant, and often cruel, but he kept his affairs in order, or so he claimed. As for enemies, if there are any, they do not reside under this roof. There was a brittle silence. She folded her hands in her lap, one thumb unconsciously circling the other. "You must understand," she said at last. "There was no love lost between us. I married Etienne because I was expected to. He needed a wife and I needed security. That is how such marriages are made." Her voice held neither shame nor sentimentality, only fact, stated plainly. It was more unnerving than if she had wept. Poirot nodded slowly. "And yet it is you who inherits everything." Élodie held his gaze without flinching. "Yes. By his will, the chateau and estate passed to me, as is customary." I muttered under my breath, barely audible, "That does make things very convenient." Her eyes flicked toward me sharply. "Do you think I had a hand in my husband's death, Captain Hastings?" I cleared my throat, feeling suddenly awkward. "I'm not one to jump to conclusions, madame. I'm here to listen and to learn, not to accuse." She regarded me steadily for a moment before replying, "That is more than I can say for most." When we finally rose to leave the salon, the chill in the corridor seemed to deepen, the pale winter light casting long, sombre shadows. Inspector Duval remained close behind us, his eyes sharp and restless, betraying his eagerness to conclude the matter swiftly. Poirot paused beside a faded tapestry, running a finger lightly over its worn threads as if lost in thought. "Well, Hastings," he said softly, "tell me. What do you see?" I glanced back toward the room where Madame Élodie still lingered, her composure unbroken. "She's clever," I said quietly. "Unemotional, controlled. If she is guilty, I doubt she will ever confess." "Ah, but confession is not always needed. Truth has many avenues, some paved in logic, others in vanity. Why poison? To avoid blood. Too clean a death for a crime of passion." Poirot smiled faintly. "Just so. But also, it is a woman's method. Subtle, personal, and always close at hand." Duval snorted. "The signs are plain, and the victim's own wife is the obvious suspect. No need for riddles or psychology." Poirot gave the inspector a measured look, unfazed by his bluntness. "Monsieur Duval, justice requires patience, not haste. Truth is more intricate than a single accusation." Duval folded his arms, bristling but silent for a moment before speaking again. "If the truth hides behind subtleties and vanities, then it will not escape me. But mark my words, the law will catch her." Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. "Perhaps. But before judgment we must speak with others in the household. Each may carry a piece of this puzzle." Duval's face tightened. "More interviews?" "Very well, but time is short." I looked between the two men. "We shall begin at once, Inspector. Every witness may shed light on this dark affair." Poirot inclined his head in agreement. "Yes, Hastings, the puzzle begins to reveal itself, and the chateau itself holds its secrets close." As we moved deeper into the heart of the Vernet estate, I felt a stirring unease. The day promised long hours of questioning, and perhaps the first true glimmers of the truth. Chapter 3. The Dead Man's Will. The chateau seemed cloaked in silence as we began the task of questioning those who had lived closest to Etienne Vernet in his final days. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken resentments and fragile alliances. and I could sense Poirot's sharp mind eagerly piecing together every nuance. Inspector Duval accompanied us. He walked a pace ahead, brisk and unsmiling, as if by sheer momentum he could force the truth into the open. I suspected he found Poirot's methods too delicate by half, and the feeling, I was sure, was mutual. Our first interview was with Monsieur Besson, the family doctor, a soft-spoken man whose gentle manner did little to mask the weight of his apprehensions. We found him in a small study lined with medical texts and faint traces of lavender, the windows shuttered against the afternoon glare. "Dr. Besson," Poirot began with polite gravity, "you attended Monsieur Vernet in his final hours. Tell us, if you please, what was your impression of his health in the days preceding his death?" The doctor adjusted his spectacles and sighed, his expression grave. Etienne was a man of some vigor, but prone to bouts of irritability. Lately he complained of headaches and occasional dizziness, which I attributed to stress. Nothing that, at the time, suggested the end was near. Duval leaned forward. "Did he mention any specific symptoms? Anything that might suggest poisoning?" Besson's brow furrowed. "Only vague complaints, fatigue, a troubled stomach. When I was summoned that night I suspected food poisoning, but the speed and severity were troubling, not typical." Poirot tapped a finger lightly on the desk. "So you suspected foul play even then?" "I considered it, yes, quietly. The symptoms were abrupt, violent, but without a toxin identified, suspicion alone is not proof." "And yet," said Poirot softly, "sometimes the shadow of a thing tells us more than its presence." Duval made a small, impatient sound. "The post-mortem has yet to reveal definitive traces. So far we have no concrete substance, only speculation." Besson hesitated. "Perhaps, but there is something else. Recently, Etienne voiced concerns to me, vague, difficult to pin down. He spoke of unseen threats, betrayals, a sense that someone close to him meant harm." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Did he mention anyone by name?" "No, but he was not a fanciful man for all his severity. If he feared betrayal, I believe it was based in reality. He'd grown wary, distrustful." Duval folded his arms. "Could that not be explained by age, declining health, anxiety?" Besson turned to him with a level gaze. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it was the kind of clarity that comes too late." I saw Poirot's expression shift subtly, the way it does when a piece has found its place. "Doctor," he said, "were there any medications administered on the night of his death?" "None by me. I had provided some sleeping tablets the week before, mild and accounted for. He was particular about who handled his medicine. Mostly, it was prepared by the kitchen or taken with meals." Poirot nodded. "So the opportunity for mischief would lie with those in the household." "Or the kitchen," Duval said quickly. "We'll question the staff next." Poirot ignored him. "Tell me, doctor, was Madame Élodie present when you arrived?" "She was," Besson said slowly. "Composed. Strikingly so. She did not weep. She did not panic. But then not everyone shows grief in the same way." As we rose to leave, the doctor glanced toward the darkening windows. Monsieur Vernet was a man who built walls around himself. In the end, I fear they kept out help as well as harm. Walking back through the long corridors, Duval said nothing, but I could see the frown on his face. He did not enjoy being reminded of the intangible. Poirot, however, looked altogether more satisfied. "You noticed that, Hastings?" he murmured. "The doctor's hesitation? A careful choice of words. Something is beginning to glimmer." "You think he knows more than he says?" "I think," said Poirot, "that he has seen something. Whether he realizes what he has seen, Ah, that is another matter entirely. We found Marie Vernet standing by the tall windows of the Château's library, her posture impeccably straight, hands clasped calmly before her. Her expression was one of reserved authority, like a governess overseeing a household rather than a grieving sister. Inspector Duval was already in the room, his notebook in hand and his manner clipped with officialdom. He gave us a curt nod as we joined him, and I sensed that he had made little headway with Marie. "Madame Vernet," Poirot began with measured politeness, "we appreciate your time. It is important for us to understand the atmosphere here in the days leading to your brother's passing." She inclined her head slightly. "Of course. It is only right that the truth be sought." "Tell us, then, about your relationship with Etienne," I asked. Marie's voice was steady, almost formal. "We were siblings, bound by blood and duty, but not affection. Etienne was a man of strong will and exacting standards. Our differences were well known, and he ruled this estate with a firm hand." Poirot pressed gently. "And the household itself? Were there tensions among those who lived here?" Marie's eyes flickered briefly toward the window, then back to us. "Tensions exist in all families, especially in one where wealth and property are at stake. It is no secret that the arrival of Madame Élodie introduced a shift in the household's balance, though I reserve judgment on personal matters." Duval's pen scratched impatiently across the page. "Are you implying she was disliked?" Marie gave a small, controlled smile. "Let us say, Inspector, that she was not embraced. Was your brother troubled by anything in particular before his death? Any conflicts?" Marie's gaze sharpened. "Etienne was a man who held his cards close. If there were troubles, he did not confide them to me." Poirot inclined his head. "And the will, Madame?" "It is understood that the estate was left entirely to Madame Élodie." Marie's eyes narrowed, and she gave a brief, almost reluctant nod. "Yes. My brother's final will leaves everything to Élodie. I would be dishonest if I said it sat comfortably with me." Her voice carried a sharp edge, tinged with bitterness at Élodie's sudden elevation. "To me, Élodie has always been little more than a stranger, an outsider married in for convenience rather than affection, and now to see her installed as the sole mistress of the Château, it is a bitter pill to swallow." Poirot's gaze was steady, and I could see him watching Marie's every expression with quiet intensity. "She has had some time since her marriage," Marie said quietly, "to grow acquainted with those who manage the estate. Henri Charvet, the steward, is among them. There are murmurs, nothing spoken openly, that their connection may have been somewhat closer than one might expect." Her voice softened, but the meaning remained clear. "A man well placed within the household, and a woman who stands to inherit much. If one were to consider possible motives, such a bond might raise questions." Duval's eyebrows rose. "Are you suggesting an impropriety?" "I suggest nothing," she replied evenly. "But I have observed their frequent discussions, their ease in one another's company. In a household like this, such things are noticed." She turned away then, her figure rigid, as if daring us to challenge her. We thanked her and took our leave. Duval said nothing until we were halfway down the corridor. "She's bitter," he muttered. "Jealous, perhaps. These rumors about Charvet, nothing solid." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Non, Duval, but sometimes the bitterness contains a kernel of truth, and it is not what one says, but what one chooses to say instead, that reveals the deeper current." As we descended the grand staircase, I glanced back toward the library doors. Marie Vernet stood as she had before, still, upright, and utterly alone. Chapter 4. The Plot Thickens. Madame Javet was in the Château's vast kitchen, a room heavy with the scent of herbs and fading embers in the hearth. The cook was a stout woman of middle age, her hands still dusted with flour, her face framed by a tightly pinned white cap. She regarded us with a wary eye, as if accustomed to guarding the Château's secrets as jealously as its silverware. "Madame Javet," Poirot began gently, "you prepared the supper on the night Monsieur Vernet fell ill?" She nodded, folding her large hands before her. "Yes, monsieur, I remember it well. Madame Elodie asked for a gâteau d'amande, an almond cake she wanted to serve to Monsieur Vernet after dinner. Did you notice anything unusual in the kitchen that evening? Anything out of place?" The cook shook her head firmly. "No, monsieur. The ingredients were fresh, and everything was prepared as usual. I would never allow anything to be amiss in my kitchen." "Was Madame Elodie present while the cake was prepared?" "Oui. She supervised, tasting the batter and instructing me on the almond essence. She was quite particular." "And who else ate from the cake?" Madame Javet hesitated, then said, "Only Monsieur Vernet. The rest of the household had already eaten earlier. When he joined us for the delayed supper, he insisted on having a piece of the cake, despite my warnings about his stomach troubles." "Warnings?" The cook's eyes flickered with concern. Monsieur Vernet had been complaining of stomach troubles all evening. I told Madame Elodie it might be better not to give him the cake, but she was determined. Duval scribbled something quickly. "You mean she insisted?" The cook's mouth pulled into a tight line. "She said it would cheer him up, that it was tradition. I warned them both. He ate it anyway." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Did you observe any quarrels or tensions in the household that evening?" Madame Javet's gaze dropped for a moment. "Tensions? Always. This house has more silence than conversation. But that night, no, nothing I could name. Though—" She hesitated. "Though?" Duval prompted sharply. "There was a moment, before supper. I saw Madame Elodie speaking with Monsieur Charvet in the herb garden, close, quiet. It wasn't my place to listen, but they were familiar." Duval made a noise of annoyance. "More of these rumors." Poirot, however, simply inclined his head. "Thank you, Madame Javet. Your candor is appreciated." As we left the kitchen, I could not help but notice the faint tremor in the cook's hands. Whether from fear or something else, I could not say. Poirot's eyes, however, were unreadable. Our next interview took place in the servants' wing, where Claudine, the housekeeper, awaited us. She was a tall, angular woman with a weathered face and a no-nonsense air, the kind who had run households longer than some people had been alive. There was a quiet authority in her manner, the sort that comes from years of listening, observing, and saying very little. Poirot inclined his head politely. "Madame Claudine, you have served the Vernet family for many years. I should like to understand, what was the mood in the household in the weeks before Monsieur Vernet's death?" She folded her hands in her lap. Monsieur Etienne was not an easy man, but he kept order. Since Madame Elodie arrived, things have shifted. She brought with her a different air. Quiet, but watchful. Not everyone has grown accustomed to her. I saw Poirot's brows lift just slightly, a signal, perhaps, that something in her tone had caught his interest. "Were there any particular frictions?" She hesitated. "There were strains between Madame Elodie and Mademoiselle Marie. The two did not see eye to eye. I suspect they never will." Duval interjected with a clipped tone. "And what sort of strains, madame?" "Arguments, accusations." "No open quarrels, Inspector," she replied cautiously, "but the kind of coldness that speaks volumes in silence." "And Monsieur Charvet?" Poirot asked mildly. "The steward?" Claudine's expression cooled. "Henri is essential to the estate. He knows the land, The tenants, the books. Without him the place would falter, but— She paused, choosing her words with care. He and Madame Élodie have become familiar. Too familiar, some might say. I glanced at Poirot, but he was studying Claudine intently, his hands neatly folded. Familiar in what way? He asked gently. There are conversations behind closed doors, glances exchanged when they think no one sees. Perhaps it is nothing, she added quickly. But in a house like this, whispers travel fast. Poirot gave a small nod. And on the night of Monsieur Vernet's illness, you noticed nothing amiss? Claudine shook her head. No, only that Monsieur was irritable at supper more than usual. He seemed to be in discomfort. Madame Élodie, on the other hand, remained calm, entirely calm. Her voice carried a note of suspicion, though she was too disciplined to state it outright. Duval closed his notebook with a snap. Thank you, madame. If anything else comes to mind, however trivial, you will inform us. She nodded stiffly. Of course, Inspector. Poirot stood. Thank you, Madame Claudine. You have been most helpful. As we stepped into the corridor, I said under my breath, There's something between Élodie and this Charvet fellow. You heard it. Poirot gave a quiet smile. Ah, Hastings, I heard the suggestion. But whether that something is affection, manipulation, or opportunity, that is what we must untangle. Duval glanced back. And if it is opportunity, he said coolly, we may already be looking at motive. Poirot's expression did not change, but I could see a glint of agreement in his eyes. Henri Charvet waited for us in the estate office, seated behind a desk littered with ledgers and folded maps of the grounds. Outside the narrow window, the sun had dipped low, casting the Château's shadows long and slanted across the lawns. He rose as we entered, eyes sharp beneath a composed expression. Monsieur Charvet, Poirot began without preamble, a brief matter if you will indulge us. You were not at supper last night, nor mentioned by anyone at the table. That is correct, Charvet replied evenly. I dined alone. I had no wish to join the family that evening. You were missed, Poirot said lightly, and yet it appears you were not entirely absent. Charvet blinked just once. Before the meal, Poirot continued, you were seen in the herb garden with Madame Élodie. A pause, very slight, but it stretched. Yes, Charvet said at last. We spoke briefly about the rosemary beds. They've been overrun with wild sorrel. She has an interest in the garden, and I suggested we bring in the gardener from Échiré. Duval shifted beside me, unimpressed. That's a very casual explanation. Madame Javet described your manner as familiar, not merely professional. Poirot raised a hand gently, as if to temper Duval's bluntness. Madame Javet's observations, while valuable, must be weighed carefully. Nevertheless, Monsieur Charvet, would you say your relationship with Madame Élodie extended beyond steward and mistress? Charvet's mouth tightened. I was entrusted with managing a vast and aging estate. Naturally, I worked closely with her. If others saw that as improper, that says more about them than it does about us. And Monsieur Vernet? Was he aware of your cooperation? Charvet didn't answer immediately. When he did, his tone was deliberate. Etienne mistrusted everyone. He kept no confidants, but yes, I believe he resented my influence with Madame. Poirot tapped the edge of the desk with a gloved fingertip. And last night, after your conversation in the garden, you saw her again? No, Charvet said. I went to my quarters, reviewed the harvest accounts, and retired. That was the end of it. Poirot tilted his head. And this morning? I stayed clear of the main house. I did not know of Etienne's condition until I was summoned. Too late to be of use. Duval shot a glance at Poirot. So, you expect us to believe you had no reason or opportunity to interfere? Charvet's expression hardened. I expect you to consider my words carefully. There was silence. Poirot seemed almost to nod in agreement. Then he asked in a voice so casual it might have been an afterthought, Do you often supervise the kitchen garden in the evenings? Henri's eyes flicked upward. When needed. Poirot smiled faintly. Oui, when needed. We took our leave. As we stepped into the corridor, I could feel the weight of Poirot's thoughts pressing in around us. Well? I asked. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Ah, Hastings, when a man lies, it is often not what he hides that reveals him, but how neatly he pretends nothing ever needed hiding. He paused. Monsieur Charvet's story is tidy, too tidy. Duval grunted agreement. I'm ready to dig deeper. And with that, he walked on, the quiet tap of his cane the only sound in the stone hall, like the ticking of a clock counting down to revelation. Chapter 5. A Matter of Timing. Back in the quiet of our rooms at the inn, with a crackling fire warding off the December chill, Poirot paced the floor with the restless energy of a caged cat. Inspector Duval, looking grim and impatient, stood by the mantelpiece while I watched them both, my mind a jumble of accusations and whispers. The case is clear, Duval stated flatly, breaking the silence. The wife, Élodie, stood to inherit a fortune. She was in a loveless marriage and was having an affair with the steward, Charvet. Every witness confirms it. She prepared the cake, she served the cake, and the man died. Motive, means, and opportunity. It is a straight line, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot stopped his pacing and turned, a glint in his eye. A straight line is often the most deceptive, Inspector. It is so simple, so obvious that one is discouraged from looking for the elegant curve. You have a story, a very good one, but it has one fatal flaw. Duval folded his arms. And what might that be? The timing, mon ami. The timing is all wrong, Poirot said, tapping a finger in the air for emphasis. Consider the evidence of your own witnesses. Madame Javet, the cook, Claudine, the housekeeper. They are both quite clear. Monsieur Vernet was already unwell before supper. He was irritable, in discomfort. Madame Javet explicitly warned against him eating the rich cake for that very reason. I sat forward. But he did eat it, and then he died. A prey, Hastings, not a cause de, Poirot corrected gently. After, not because of. The poison, the doctor tells us, was swift and violent in its final manifestation. Yet the symptoms were already beginning before he ever touched the fork to the cake. The cake, my friend, is a distraction, a vulgar piece of theatre designed to fix our attention on Madame Élodie and her lover. He set the ornament down with a decisive click. If a man is already feeling the effects of poison before he eats his supper, then we must ask ourselves a different question. What did he consume in the hour before? The logic of it was undeniable. Duval's confident posture faltered for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. My own conviction, so recently settled on Élodie and Charvet, began to crumble, replaced by the familiar feeling of admiration for Poirot's unerring ability to see past the obvious. His evening routine, I murmured. We must learn his routine. Précisément. And for that we require the one person who would know it best. The following morning, we returned to the Château, bypassing the main rooms and requesting an audience with Monsieur Vernet's personal valet, a man thus far unmentioned by the family. We found him in a small, tidy room in the servants' quarters. His name was Marcel, an elderly man with stooped shoulders and a face etched with a lifetime of quiet service. He had served Etienne Vernet and his father before him, for over 40 years. Poirot approached him with a gentleness that was reserved for those he deemed honest witnesses to tragedy. "Monsieur Marcel," he began, "forgive our intrusion. We need your help to understand your master's final hours. Tell us of his habits. The hour before he joined the family for supper, what did he do?" The old man's hands trembled slightly. "Always the same, monsieur. For 20 years it has been the same. At 6 o'clock he would leave his business in the estate office and go to his private study. He would read the evening papers, and at precisely 6:30, I would bring him his glass of brandy." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And on the night of his death? Did this routine vary?" "Not at all, monsieur," Marcel said sadly. "I brought the decanter and his glass as always. He poured it himself. I left him to his privacy." The valet paused, his brow furrowed in recollection. "But when I returned at 7 to inform him that supper was delayed, he was changed. He was pale and clutching his stomach. He accused me of letting the fire die down, but the room was warm. He said a fire was burning inside him." My heart gave a leap. "And this was before he went down to supper? Before he ate the almond cake?" "Oui, monsieur. An hour before, at least," Marcel confirmed. "He blamed it on a bottle of wine he had opened at luncheon. He was a man who never admitted weakness, so he waved me away." Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but insistent. "The brandy, Marcel, the decanter. Who had access to it? Who had access to the study during the day?" "Many people, monsieur. The housekeeper, Claudine, sees to the cleaning. Monsieur Charvet sometimes brings papers for signing. Madame Elodie. She rarely entered. The master preferred his study to be his own." He hesitated. "But Mademoiselle Marie, she was often in and out." "For what reason?" Poirot asked. "She would check the books on the shelves, ensure everything was dusted to her satisfaction. She said I was getting old, that my eyes missed things. She was very particular about the study, more than any other room. She would sometimes pour the master's brandy herself, if she was there when I arrived, saying she wished to be of service to her brother." A heavy silence fell over the small room. We had found it. The opportunity. The means. The true moment the poison had been administered. Poirot gave a slow, deliberate nod. He thanked the distraught valet for his time, and we took our leave with Inspector Duval, who had been listening from the doorway with growing astonishment, following in our wake. Without a word, Poirot led us directly to Etienne Vernet's study. It was a dark, masculine room, dominated by a heavy oak desk and the lingering scent of leather and old paper. On a small side table stood a crystal decanter of brandy, half full, and a single empty glass. Poirot picked up the glass, examining it against the grey light from the window. He said nothing, but his meaning was clear. Duval, for his part, stared at the decanter, his face a mask of dawning comprehension. The case he had built so confidently against the wife had just crumbled to dust. "The cake was a lie," I whispered. "Worse, Hastings," Poirot replied, placing the glass back on the table with immense care. "It was a truth told to hide a bigger lie. All eyes were on the unloving wife who stood to inherit a fortune. No one thought to look at the bitter sister, standing quietly in the shadows, performing a simple daily ritual of service." Chapter 6. The Confession. The great salon of the Château Vernet, once a room of ancestral pride and polished ceremony, had taken on the heavy stillness of a courtroom. Outside, the winter dusk clung to the leaded glass like a shroud, and inside, the fire crackled with a kind of nervous energy, throwing long shadows against the panelled walls. By Poirot's instruction, chairs had been arranged in a deliberate semicircle before the hearth. At first glance, it might have seemed a gesture of civility. an invitation to sit, to speak. In truth, it was the theatre of revelation. Inspector Duval stood grim-faced beside the window, his arms folded tightly across his chest. Élodie Vernet sat nearest the fire, her face pale but composed, hands folded in her lap like an effigy in marble. Henri Charvet loomed behind her, jaw set, eyes unreadable. Dr. Besson watched from the corner, his expression a mask of reluctant anticipation. And finally, opposite Poirot himself, sat Mademoiselle Marie Vernet, ramrod straight, her mourning attire as precise and unforgiving as her mouth. Poirot, standing alone before them, radiated the peculiar stillness that always preceded one of his performances. It was the calm of a master violinist before the first note. Quiet, but electric. "Mes amis," he began, his voice a gentle ripple in the silence. "You wonder why I have gathered you here. You suspect, perhaps, a grand announcement. You are correct. But it is not accusation I offer, not yet. It is clarity." He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room. "For days we have followed the obvious line, the wife who inherits, the almond cake laced with poison, the whispers of an affair. Ah, it is a delicious tale, n'est-ce pas? But also one too neatly constructed. It is, if I may say so, a tale intended to be believed." Élodie stirred slightly, but said nothing. Poirot turned to Duval. "You saw the wife and the lover, and you stopped there. Motive, means, opportunity. But you overlooked one thing, the very foundation of crime itself, timing." He let the word hang in the air like a blade. "You see, the symptoms of poisoning began long before the cake was served. The discomfort, the irritability, the heat burning inside him. It was already present when Etienne Vernet sat down to dinner. The cake was not the cause, it was the misdirection." A stunned hush followed, then Charvet leaning forward. "Then how—" Poirot held up a hand. "You will forgive me if I now take us back to 6 o'clock on the evening of the murder. At that hour, Monsieur Vernet retired to his study, as was his custom. And at 6:30, his valet, faithful Marcel, brought him a glass of brandy. Etienne poured his own brandy, as was his habit. Poirot moved to the side table, where a crystal decanter gleamed in the firelight. He touched it with the delicacy of a priest handling sacrament. This very decanter, untouched since the night of the crime. Earlier today it was tested. What did it contain, you ask? Strychnine. Not in great measure, no, but enough. Enough to cause violent agony. Enough to kill. Élodie gasped audibly. Charvet's hand gripped the back of her chair. Poirot turned slowly to Marie. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "you were often in your brother's study. Marcel tells us so. You ensured it was kept tidy, arranged just so. You criticized his work, offered your help. On more than one occasion you poured Etienne's brandy yourself." Her eyes narrowed. "I was assisting the household. The chateau is mine as well." Poirot stepped closer. "That is the tragedy, is it not? It was yours, until your brother left it all, every stone, every vineyard, every franc, to the woman you despised, the outsider, the stranger in black." Marie's hands, gloved in kid leather, curled tightly around the arms of her chair. "You watched as she replaced you," Poirot continued, his voice low, intimate. "You saw her welcomed where you were dismissed, entrusted where you were ignored. Your brother, once the tyrant you could at least predict, had turned his favor to another." A flush rose to her cheeks. "He betrayed our family," she said quietly. "He allowed her to sink her claws into everything. He let her push me aside." Poirot's tone remained gentle. "And so you resolved to punish him, not with spectacle, not with blood, but with something quieter, slower, a death that would look like indulgence, the brandy, the cake, not like murder." There was a long pause. Then, "You have no proof," Marie said, her voice hoarse. "Non," Poirot replied, "not the kind a court demands. But I have the truth. I have the pattern of your bitterness, so expertly hidden beneath civility. I have your careful oversight of the study, your endless devotion to its order, not out of duty, but possession. And I have Marcel's words, spoken without guile. Sometimes she poured the brandy herself." Poirot's gaze was unflinching now. "And I have this, mademoiselle, the one error you could not prevent. Your brother began to die before he took the first bite of that cake." Marie said nothing. Then, without warning, she laughed. Short, bitter, brittle. "It was mine," she whispered. "Long before she came, it was all mine. He told me once as a child, 'One day this will be yours, Marie.' And then she arrived, with her soft voice and her quiet strength, and he changed his mind." Her eyes moved to Elodie, burning. "You took him from me, and then you took everything." "I never wanted his love," Elodie said quietly. "Only peace." Marie turned back to Poirot. "I did not mean for him to die. Not like that. I only wanted to frighten him, remind him that I was not invisible." Poirot gave a small, solemn bow. "But poison is not a language of warning. It is a language of finality." Duval stepped forward at last. The authority returned to his voice. "Marie Vernet, you are hereby under arrest for the murder of your brother, Monsieur Etienne Vernet." She rose slowly, with the dignity of a queen brought low. And as she was led from the room, her eyes never left Elodie. The silence that followed was like the air after a storm, still, but full of aftershocks. Poirot turned back to the fire and adjusted a log with the tip of his shoe. "Bitterness, Hastings," he murmured, "is the most enduring of poisons. It kills slowly, until, at last, it consumes everything." I looked at him, marveling, as I always did, at the vastness of his intellect. "And yet," I said softly, "I almost believed it was Elodie." Poirot smiled faintly. "As you were meant to, mon ami. The best illusions are not the ones we invent, but the ones we long to believe." And with that, he picked up his hat and cane, and we stepped into the fading winter light, leaving the château and its ghosts behind. Epilogue: Ashes and Vines. The new year came to Saint-Forgeux under a pale sky, snow melting into dark furrows between the vines, the château silent beneath its heavy slate roof. Though the scandal had rippled through Dordogne like a stone across still water, the villagers, in that ancient peasant way, resumed their lives quickly. Death, even violent death, was no stranger to the land. I had expected, perhaps, that Madame Elodie Vernet would leave the château, sell the estate, retreat to Paris, and vanish into polite obscurity. But she did not. Instead, she remained. She buried Etienne in the family plot beneath a headstone both elegant and spare. She dismissed no servants. She made no dramatic proclamations. In the days that followed her sister-in-law's arrest, she moved through the corridors of the house not like a widow clinging to the past, but like a woman reacquainting herself with her own skin. 1 week after the confession, Poirot received a letter, handwritten, fine paper, sealed with black wax. It read, "Monsieur Poirot, you once told me that justice requires patience, and that truth reveals itself in fragments. I believe you were right. The house is quiet now, the vineyard sleeps, but it will wake again, as we all must, in time. As for the rumors that linger in Inspector Duval's notebook and the servants' whispers, I shall say this and no more. Henri Charvet was never my lover, but he was my ally. In this house of closed shutters and cold corridors, We found in one another a language of understanding that required no impropriety. Let the world believe what it will. I remain, in widowhood as in marriage, bound by my own choices. Élodie Vernet. Poirot read it once, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the pocket of his waistcoat. "Elegant," he murmured, "and elusive to the last. What do you think, Hastings?" "I think," I said, "she told us precisely what she wanted us to know, and left the rest to history." Poirot smiled faintly. "Exactement. And so she restores the symmetry." We never saw Madame Élodie again. But some months later, a note from Giraud informed us that she had quietly hired new tenants for the lower vineyards, invested in repairing the estate's crumbling roof, and hosted a modest fete for the villagers in the early spring. It was said she wore violet that day, not black, and walked the terraces alone at dusk, pausing often to gaze across the rows of budding vines, as if awaiting something, or someone. But if Henri Charvet walked beside her, it was never spoken of. And in Poirot's files, beneath the label Château Vernet, he penciled a final note. La vérité, comme le vin, s'épanouit dans le silence. Truth, like wine, ripens in silence. As the chateau's shadows lift, Hercule Poirot exposes Marie Vernet's bitter revenge. Poisoned brandy, not the almond cake, claimed her brother Etienne's life, driven by resentment over a stolen inheritance. Murder in the chateau ends with justice served, yet echoes of fractured loyalty linger like frost on the vines. We hope this winter tale of betrayal has gripped you, dear listeners. Did you suspect the sister's silent fury, or were you deceived by the wife's composure? Share your thoughts below. If Murder in the Château has enthralled you, please like and subscribe to Nocturnal Tales for more tales of suspense. Support our craft with a tip via Super Thanks or by joining our membership. Link in the description. Thank you for joining us. And until our next tale, may your nights be filled with intrigue and your days with clarity.